He was her first love.
She loved him so much.
There was something about this boy. There was no keeping them two apart.
But in one terrible instant, it was over.
She had a bullet in her chest.
They left her to die in the street.
It's shocking, very shocking.
All we did was just cry.
Detectives must dig for answers.
Tell us what happened. The person who did this needs to come forward. I don't think of it as snitching.
And a grieving family demands the truth.
Yeah, I helped cover it up.
You don't do that to somebody you love.
The only thing I want is justice for my daughter.
9th, 2018, Rochester, New York. It's after midnight in this city of 200,000, just south of Lake Ontario.
Rochester is the third largest city in the state of New York. It has a lot of charms to it, has a lot of festivals, a lot of places to hike. But at the same time, Rochester has a dark component. It's one of the most dangerous cities in the entire country. It is also one of the poorest cities in the entire country.
It is pretty high crime for as small of a city as we have. There are several nice neighborhoods and then several bad neighborhoods.
At 12:35 a.m., in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, the Northern Crescent, patrol units respond to a 911 call on Delamain Drive.
There was an anonymous caller reporting that there was a person shot.
The individual who called 911 was not giving up much information other than that the person shot was in Delamain.
When officers arrive at the address the caller had given, they find two young women in the driveway outside the house.
One was kneeling down and she had another female propped up against her.
Everything's gonna be fine.
Officers are not yet sure this is the gunshot victim.
What's wrong with your friend?
I don't know.
He appeared to be somewhat lethargic, kind of out of it.
Did you call 911?
No, I just sounded like this.
The young woman identifies herself as Haley Winters.
The young woman, 18-year-old Haley Winters, said that she was walking down the street when she found the victim collapsed in the driveway.
It doesn't take long for officers to notice blood on the victim.
The officers were able to observe what appeared to be a contact wound to her arm.
Who shot you? Can you hear me? Who shot you? What's her name?
Sierra Grimes.
Sierra, can you hear me?
Sierra is unresponsive, but doesn't appear to have lost too much blood.
It was puzzling for the officers at the scene because the bullet wound to her arm didn't appear all that severe.
But officers soon realize the wound to her arm isn't Sierra's only injury.
A bullet had traveled through her arm, entered her chest cavity under her armpit.
She's got a severe gunshot wound to her chest. Go ahead and start me an ambulance. One female and gunshot wound.
Oh my God, Sierra!
Is there still time to save this young woman's life? 18-year-old Sierra Grimes grew up in a tight-knit and loving home.
We had so many good times, me, her sister, and her brother.
She just loved being around family.
We would just sit on the couch for hours and just binge watch different shows.
However, while Sierra loved spending time with her family, the teenager was very social.
She wasn't shy. That's one thing I can say about Sierra. She wasn't shy. She was a very outgoing girl.
She loves the hip-hop scene. She loves all that. Anything with music, she was into it.
She loved to sing it. She loved to dance.
She was a people person. She's crazy and fun.
She was a very, very loving girl.
But Sierra also had a little bit of a tough side.
If she has something on her mind, she will tell you.
She's a little sassy. As soon as you do something she don't like, she's blunt about the situation, and she's upfront, you know?
She was a fighter. She didn't take no crap from nobody.
She's gonna stand up for what she believes in. She doesn't care what nobody says.
Sierra was not scared to tell anybody how she felt.
Including her feelings for her classmate, 17-year-old Jermaine Brown.
Sierra liked him so much, but let him know. He was pretty cool. Like, he was nice. I think like 14, 15, when he first was just a little fling.
In middle school, they just was texting on the phone. You know, they tried a little puppy love relationship, from what Ciara told me.
By the time Ciara was 18, the couple's puppy love had turned serious.
He used to come over every day, and we used to bake cookies. Me, him, and Ciara used to bake cookies together because there was never a day he didn't come over and didn't want cookies.
Making my favorite, I see.
How are they?
Sweet. Like you.
Their relationship, it was good. It was really good.
They seemed like they had love there. It seemed like it was real.
Can you guys get a room?
She could go talk to him about certain things. She wouldn't feel comfortable with talking about me or to my mom or to certain people, you know? That was her person to confide in, you know what I'm saying? That's that person made her feel safe.
He was kind. He was nice and gentle.
He had also become a part of the family.
I loved Jermaine, and my daughter was good to him, and so was my family.
As much as Ciara cherished her relationship with Jermaine, she never lost sight of her future.
She was about to graduate from high school. She knew what she wanted to do.
She was gonna sign up for school for cosmetology. She loved doing hair. She had a passion for that.
She did hair all the time. In my house, it was hair everywhere because they would use the extension hairs and stuff and braid and stuff. All the girls used to come over.
She wanted to be out there, do something, interact with people. And doing hair was that for her.
But the bright future ahead of Ciara was in serious jeopardy. On the night of May 9th, 2018, an ambulance arrives to try to save the life of the 18-year-old.
First responding officer saw that Ciara had suffered a gunshot wound through her chest.
She was fighting for her life, and my sister was strong.
They bring an ambulance, they transport her to the hospital.
As the EMTs load Ciara into the ambulance, officers at the scene turn to Haley Winters, the young woman who'd been holding Ciara when they arrived.
All right, so what happened?
I don't know. I was walking down the street and I just found her here.
She claimed that she found her laying in the street and didn't realize that she had been shot.
But is she telling the truth?
It seemed a little suspicious.
You hiding something. You know something.
18 years old and only a few weeks away from graduating high school, Ciara Grimes had a bright future ahead of her.
She was very excited. She was ready. She wanted to go to school for cosmetology.
Ciara had also found love with 17-year-old Jermaine Brown.
Ciara and Jermaine had basically been together since middle school.
She loved him so much, and he was always with her.
But now, not long after midnight on May 9th, 2018, paramedics and police have just responded to a 911 call and arrived to find Ciara with a gunshot wound to the chest.
There was a 911 call that came in from an anonymous caller that there was a person shot.
Police responded to the address the caller gave and found Ciara and her friend, Haley Winters.
She was kneeling on the sidewalk near the street, and she had Ciara Grimes propped up against her, and she was holding her.
Haley had no information in regards to who called 911.
Detectives arrive on the scene moments after the ambulance rushes Ciara to the hospital, and talking to Haley is their first priority.
Do you think she's gonna be okay?
I'm sure the doctors are gonna do everything they can.
Were you two friends?
Yeah, we were supposed to hang out tonight. She sent me a text saying we should meet up.
Where?
On the corner up the street.
She indicated that as she was walking up the street, she observed Ciara at the driveway.
When I saw her, I could tell something wasn't right.
Haley said Ciara was stumbling around, and as she approached, Ciara collapsed in the driveway.
And she didn't say who shot her?
No, she couldn't really speak.
Detectives have doubts that Haley's telling them the whole truth.
The first clue my partner and I had that Haley wasn't being completely honest was the way they were dressed.
Ciara and Haley were wearing tank tops and shorts, and in Rochester, Maine, it's not considered very warm that time of day.
So it didn't appear that she'd been walking down the street. It appeared that they had both just come out of a house.
Detectives didn't actually suspect that Haley was the shooter. but they did think that she knew more than she was telling them.
Rather than let Haley go, detectives ask her to wait in the back of a squad car.
Am I in trouble?
No, but we may have a few more questions. Why don't you get warm in the back of the cruiser?
We definitely thought she was an eyewitness right from the beginning. I don't think she realized at the time the gravity of the situation.
Once Haley is secured in the car, officers at the scene inform detectives they've detained another friend of Sierra's they've located nearby, Deshaun Sweet.
Officers saw him walking down the street and stopped him to see if he was a witness or if he knew anything.
He said he didn't see anything.
You know Sierra?
Yeah, they told me she just got shot.
He seemed kind of confused and upset because he claimed to be very good friends with Sierra, so he was emotional.
Where were you headed when the officer stopped you?
I was headed home. I stay right down there.
The address Deshaun gave detectives just happened to be next door to the house where they found Sierra lying in the driveway.
He indicated that he had went to the store to purchase candy.
We felt Deshaun was simply not telling us the truth.
Suspecting Deshaun also knew more than he was letting on, detectives put him in the back of another patrol car.
Didn't do nothing, man.
I want you just to sit tight and get this thing figured out.
With two potential witnesses at the scene, a couple who lived just down the street approaches detectives, claiming they have vital information.
Y'all want to know who shot that girl? You need to start looking in that house there.
The neighbor indicated it was the house next door to where police found Sierra, the same house Deshaun claimed he lived in.
It was kind of a nuisance house in the neighborhood, always loud music and people coming and going.
Neighbors definitely knew of drug activity happening there.
As soon as I heard the shot, I knew exactly where it came from.
You heard the shot?
Yes.
Did you call 911?
No, that wasn't us.
They were pretty fearful of the activity going on at the house.
If what they were telling detectives was true, it sounded like Sierra's shooting had something to do with the drug activity at the house.
After talking to the neighbors, detectives approached the suspected drug house.
As soon as they climbed the front steps, the detectives were fairly certain the neighbors were right to have been suspicious.
Check it out.
Blood?
Yep.
To detectives, it's clear where Sierra had been shot.
We were pretty confident that was the crime scene because of the blood on the porch.
Could Sierra's shooter still be inside?
As detectives approached the door, they spotted someone peering at them through the blinds.
There were people inside and they refused to come to the door.
Open up. We need to talk to you.
Better talk to the judge, then.
They indicated that in order for us to enter the house, we would need a search warrant.
If you didn't do nothing, you're not gonna barricade yourself in the house.
Now detectives were all but convinced they would find Sierra's shooter hiding inside. Police now had a potential
Detectives investigating the shooting of 18-year-old Sierra Grimes believe they've just located the crime scene.
Detectives discovered blood on the porch of the house next door to where Sierra was found lying in the driveway.
People were in the house, they weren't coming out.
Rochester police are now involved in a potentially dangerous standoff.
We called in for the SWAT team, and someone from our unit started writing a search warrant for the home.
As detectives await their warrant, they receive disturbing news from the hospital.
Sierra was transported to the hospital, and she was pronounced dead at about 1:45.
Detectives are now investigating a murder. But for the moment, they make the difficult decision to hold off on notifying Sierra's family.
We wanted to have the witnesses believe that Sierra was still alive and that she would be able to communicate with us and tell us what actually happened. So it was kind of an investigative tool.
As morning comes, and with the SWAT team en route, detectives uncover what could be another valuable tool for their investigation.
There was a video surveillance on the exterior of the house right across the street.
Detectives knock on the door and make contact with the homeowner.
Yeah. Excuse me, sir. We're investigating the shooting across the street there.
Oh, Lord. Is she okay?
I'm afraid not.
Before detectives get to the security footage, though, they ask the neighbor if he'd witnessed anything unusual the night before.
I heard something that sounded like a shot. I looked through my window, and I saw that they were carrying her outside.
The witness said the group stood around outside for a minute and then fled.
A couple males walked away from the scene, and some females went back in the house.
They just ran?
Yeah, all except one girl. She stayed until you guys showed up.
Now detectives knew that Haley was definitely lying.
Detectives also wonder about Deshaun Sweet, the young man police picked up down the street from the crime scene.
Could he have been one of the young men who ran away? And if so, could he have also been the shooter?
Do you think you can identify either of the guys that ran off?
I don't know. It was pretty dark.
Is there any chance, though, that we could access your security footage?
Yeah, of course. Let me get that security footage for you.
Our technicians were able to download the video and bring it back to our office.
And now the SWAT team has arrived and descends on the house where police believe Sierra was shot.
Copy that. Moving now.
Rochester, please! Search for her!
They went in with their weapons drawn. They had to be ready for anything.
They don't know what they're walking into.
The team quickly clears the first floor. In an upstairs bedroom, they find a closed door and prepare for the worst.
Get your hands up! Let me see them! Get them behind your head!
The SWAT team finds two women who quickly surrender. As word of the standoff spreads to local news stations, camera crews arrive in time to capture the aftermath.
The women that were in the house were escorted out by the SWAT team.
Their names are Tamika Wilson and Tamra Stevens.
They were brought to our public safety building, our headquarters.
With the location secured by the SWAT team, detectives begin their search of the house. And it doesn't take them long to find evidence that strongly suggests Sierra had been in the house at some point.
Police found her ID, and they also found a letter addressed to her.
Despite the cache of evidence proving Sierra was in the house, detectives find no evidence of a shooting.
There was no blood. There was no casing from the gun. There was really no crime scene.
While the house turns up little evidence, just down the street, officers uncover what could be the murder weapon.
The weapon was found a couple doors down in a driveway under a pile of leaves.
It was immediately sent in for testing to determine if it could have been the cause of Sierra's injuries.
After finding the weapon, detectives return to the station and review the surveillance footage from across the street.
It was a crucial piece of evidence because we were able to see that Sierra was actually carried outside, left at the curb, and that a couple males walked away from the scene and that some females went back in the house.
The video was of decent quality, but not enough to identify people by their face.
We could tell who Deshaun was. His clothing was pretty distinctive, and who Haley was because she stayed with Sierra.
They could identify all of the people except one.
Now the question becomes, who is the last person in the video? To find out, they start interrogating the 4 people they have in custody, one at a time.
We confronted the witnesses with the fact that we saw the video.
We know you were there for a fact, straight up. We kind of got a good idea of what happened and what went down.
We know she was shot inside the home because other people have been talking and saying stuff.
One by one, the witnesses refuse to budge.
I didn't see what happened.
I don't know who was there last night. I'm telling you, like, I was really asleep.
They were very uncooperative, kind of had an anti-police attitude.
For the next several hours, detectives keep pressing.
Investigators knew that whenever there were several people refusing to talk, there was always one weak link.
Well, I don't even know what to tell you guys, so it's like I tell them all the time.
Detectives investigating the death of 18-year-old Sierra Grimes are questioning 4 possible witnesses to the shooting: Haley Winters, Deshaun Sweet, Tamika Wilson, and Tamara Stevens.
Haley was with Sierra when police arrived. They found Deshaun walking down the street nearby, and Tamara and Tamika were inside the house where police believe the shooting occurred.
Deshaun, Tamika, and Tamara all say they don't know what happened.
It seemed as though they were kind of guarded in the information that they were giving us.
Which means that Haley, who police found by Sierra's side after she'd been shot, is now their only hope.
And we're not asking you to snitch on anyone or tell on anyone.
During our interview with Haley, we had to kind of take baby steps with her.
Although detectives did not shy away from putting Haley on the spot.
Here's the problem. We have been looking at cameras. You were not out there alone with her.
We confronted her with the video that we had watched and that it didn't match with her initial story.
Caught in her lie, Haley decides to talk.
Okay, I'm just gonna tell you guys everything going on. So,
Haley tells detectives that she and Sierra went to the house because Sierra was supposed to meet a boy there.
I really don't know which boy she was going to see.
Haley said that Sierra had never told her the guy's name.
Haley explains that at the house, she and Sierra went upstairs.
Sierra went in the bed. It was like a way back room. And so I went in the bathroom.
Haley says she was only in the bathroom for a few minutes.
I came back out and I just heard mad yelling and stuff like that.
Haley tells detectives she ran downstairs to see what was going on and found Sierra lying on the ground.
Go out there and Sierra's like laid out and then like it was like tapping her.
She claimed Sierra was surrounded by 3 other people who, from Haley's descriptions, sounded like Deshaun, Tamara, and Tamika.
Haley said that when she asked what happened, no one really answered her question.
They just tried to get from me to do mad different stuff.
Haley says they carried Sierra off the porch and into the neighbor's driveway.
She like really hurt.
Haley, make sure you stay with her.
Haley claims the others left her alone with Sierra, and she didn't have her phone.
Detectives figured it was probably Tamika or Tamara who reported that shooting to 911.
Haley's story fits most of what the detectives already know, but they also suspect she's still holding back.
Maybe you could actually help them. Maybe this is your opportunity. You think you're going to hurt someone? Maybe you're going to be helping someone.
Because I really would like, I would have snitched by now. I honestly don't know. Like, I don't know. Nobody showed me a gun.
While Haley tries to convince detectives of her honesty, they have caught her in yet another lie.
There are 4 people besides Sierra in the video. Haley claims there were 3. So who is she protecting?
Did somebody leave that we don't have in custody right now? I think Haley initially had a hard time telling us the truth because she was very scared.
Do you understand that you almost could be an accomplice to this? So we're trying to...
Even with the possibility of her arrest on the table, Haley hesitates.
I could be wrong.
I don't know.
Going out of it.
However, detectives still have one card left to play.
We actually told Haley that Sierra had passed away.
They went through her arm and into her chest.
Are you dead serious? Are you dead serious?
Upon hearing the news, Haley completely broke down.
I wish I could tell you otherwise, but...
Yo, no, she did. No, she did.
But now that Haley knows that Sierra's dead, will she finally tell all?
And I know you're worried about talking, but you have to realize that the people in the house treated Sierra like she was a piece of trash and just took her out of the house and threw her on the front lawn.
However, despite detectives' best efforts to coax the truth out of Haley, she refused to identify Sierra's killer.
I really would tell you if I knew I was...
Getting nowhere, detectives leave Haley to stew in the interrogation room. Now, more than 7 hours after the 911 call that reported the shooting, detectives take the opportunity to reach out to Sierra's family and give them the tragic news.
A death notify is probably one of the worst parts of our job, something we don't enjoy doing.
We went to talk to Sierra's family later that morning, and we had to let them know that she had passed several hours earlier at the hospital.
The detectives came to my house, and that's the worst pain a person could go through.
I couldn't believe it, and I just started going crazy. Like, I just started bugging out.
Sierra's family said they were worried when they woke up and Sierra had never made it home. Now, their worst fears have come true.
They didn't call me. That is unacceptable.
Learning Sierra died hours earlier made the awful news even harder to bear. Even if it was to help flush out the truth about who shot her, the family was very upset they weren't told.
However, the family accepts that if it helps solve her murder, perhaps it will be worth it. Through their grief, they offer some vital information for detectives.
Sierra's family, they were very distraught, but immediately gave us answers as to who may be responsible.
As soon as we told Sierra's family that she passed away from a gunshot wound, they immediately told us that Jermaine, her boyfriend, had to be involved.
Hours after her death, Rochester detectives are making progress in identifying who shot 18-year-old Sierra Grimes.
Police had detained 4 people that they believed knew the truth.
They were very uncooperative, and it really slowed our investigation down.
But when detectives speak with Sierra's mother, the case takes a critical turn.
I was afraid he'd do something like this.
Who?
Her boyfriend, Jermaine.
We learned Jermaine Brown's name. He and Sierra had been together for a couple years.
He started off as a respectful, quiet boy.
However, Sierra's mom says that about a year into the relationship, things changed.
He started to get really bad. Like, he was always kicked out of school.
He started selling drugs and doing things he wasn't supposed to.
Jermaine soon found himself in trouble with the law.
Every time he went to jail, I had to take her to go see him. She would throw tantrums, begging me. That's how much she loved that boy.
When he was out of jail, Jermaine would test Sierra's devotion in other ways.
He started cheating on her, just being unfaithful.
And it just got worse and worse.
But Sierra's family did not know the worst of it for a long time.
One day, my mailman came and knocked on my door and told me that my daughter was being beat by him on the next street.
She was the victim of domestic violence on many occasions.
Family and friends all implored Sierra to stay away from Jermaine, but she refused.
She loved him a little bit more than she loved herself.
Her excuse all the time was, well, in his childhood, he wasn't raised well, so that's why he's acting like this with me now. And I used to just tell her, you can't make excuses for him.
Sierra's mother also ordered her daughter to stop seeing Jermaine, but it didn't work.
I walked in my house one day, and he was there, and he wasn't supposed to be there. And she had a green hat over her head and wouldn't look at me.
Take it off.
Mom, no. Mom.
Take it off.
My sister had cuts, bruises all on the top of her forehead, a big lump.
You.
I seen the lumps on her head. I grabbed that boy and I nearly strangled him and told him, you better stop touching my daughter, because I was gonna call the cops on him. And he said he didn't care.
He said, even if you call police, she's still gonna leave with me. She's not gonna press charges. He knew he had that hold over her.
Come on, Sierra. Let's go.
He really had her messed up in the head.
After that, Sierra had cut off communication with her family for 3 weeks. Then came a phone call from Sierra in the middle of the night.
It was my daughter crying. And, Mommy, I'm in pain, I'm in pain. He hit her with a 2x4.
Sierra's mother raced to her daughter's side and drove her to the hospital.
She was in bad shape.
She was just like, Mom, why does he keep doing this to me? Why does he keep hurting me?
I told her, baby, it's not your fault. Nothing that he's doing right now is your fault.
Her family believed it was the last straw for Sierra.
She finally ended up going and getting an order of protection against him.
The order was dated May 3rd. 6 days later, Sierra was dead.
Sierra's family is certain that it's no coincidence.
It's my baby son.
Detectives leave Sierra's family to grieve and begin their investigation into Jermaine Brown. When they pull Jermaine's criminal record, it confirms everything the family told them.
Jermaine Brown was known to the Rochester Police Department prior to this for drug sales, gang activity.
And he did have a history of domestic violence with our victim.
There was an active order of protection that he was supposed to stay away from her.
But had Sierra stayed away from Jermaine?
According to the police record, his most recent known address was the house where police believe the shooting occurred.
Furthermore, detectives learned Tamika Wilson and Tamara Stevens are Jermaine's sisters.
Which explained why they were so uncooperative with the police.
Doubting Tamika or Tamara would turn on their brother, detectives try witness Haley Winters one more time.
This time, when detectives revealed what they already knew about Jermaine and Sierra's relationship, his abuse, and her restraining order, Haley finally broke.
Haley now admits that she and Sierra had met up with Jermaine Brown and Deshaun Sweet at a local park on the afternoon before the shooting.
According to Haley, this was the first time Sierra had seen Jermaine since she took out the order of protection.
She knew that it could be a danger to her to be around him, but she didn't care about it. She wanted to be around him.
According to Haley, things went so well that Sierra agreed to come over to Jermaine's house at 11:30 that night.
He was supposed to meet us, like we were going over there.
Haley says that when they got to the house, she and Sierra were hanging out with Jermaine and Deshaun in an upstairs bedroom.
That was when this gun was actually pulled out by Jermaine.
Yo, check it out. Ooh.
Is that real? Where'd you get it?
Bought it off this dude.
Can I hold it?
She just was like, oh, let me see.
Here you go.
She indicated that he thought he made it safe by pulling the magazine out.
However, he didn't hand over the gun to Sierra.
Jermaine pressed it up against her arm.
Saying something to the effect of like, I should shoot you, laughing.
Jermaine, quit playing.
I should shoot you right now.
That's not funny, Jermaine. Stop. Jermaine.
Chill. It's not even.
The gun went off.
Jermaine!
He took the clip out, but one bullet was in the chamber.
Sierra, are you okay?
Haley says that after the shot went off, Sierra stumbled out of the room and the others followed.
According to Haley, no one was really sure just how badly Sierra had been hurt.
She made it down the stairs, and then she fell. Like, that was it.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. What the heck is going on? Get out of the house. Let's go!
Haley admits that's when Jermaine and Deshaun carried Sierra out of the house and over to the neighbors.
Sierra, you're gonna be all right. You're gonna be okay, okay?
Jermaine, you gotta get up out of here right now. Go!
Haley says Jermaine was concerned about Sierra, but because of his legal history, he fled.
Go, get out of here now! Go!
Despite the fact that the decisions made that night cost Sierra Grimes her life, Haley swears that her death was just a tragic accident.
But was she telling the truth? She had been caught in multiple lies at this point.
Could she have been trying to shield Jermaine from a murder charge?
Less than 24 hours after 18-year-old Sierra Grimes was found mortally wounded, Rochester detectives finally have their shooter identified as Sierra's boyfriend, 17-year-old Jermaine Brown.
The story of what happened was Jermaine was playing with a gun, laughing, and put the gun up to Sierra's arm, and it went off.
Given Jermaine's violent history towards Sierra, detectives have their doubts.
And they had several domestic incidents where he had put his hands on her and caused her physical injuries.
What detectives needed was something or someone to corroborate Haley's story.
After the interview with Haley was complete, Terry and I decided to go back and talk to Deshaun.
We would like to figure out what happened to her.
Once detectives revealed that they knew Jermaine was the shooter and had video to prove he was there, Deshaun came clean.
He did do that, though.
story was consistent to what Haley had told us.
Deshaun also admits what he was doing when police picked him up down the street from the crime scene.
Deshaun admitted to hiding the weapon.
Detectives have one more pressing question for Deshaun.
Well, where did Maine go?
I don't know.
With no leads on Jermaine Brown's whereabouts, Rochester police spend the next 5 days searching for Sierra's killer.
He did go on the run.
On May 15th, the search abruptly ends when police learn Jermaine is due to appear at the courthouse on an unrelated charge.
Through interviews of other individuals, we learned that Jermaine may possibly be going to the Hall of Justice, which is right next to police headquarters, to deal with another matter, another arrest that he had.
So we were on the lookout for him, thinking if he shows up for his other court case, and he was stopped right in front of our public safety building and taken into custody.
He had on a memorial type of T-shirt. It was a picture of him and Sierra Grimes that said "Forever" on it.
People were wondering if he really was feeling remorse over what he had done, or maybe he was trying to put on a facade and pretend like he was missing her and he had nothing to do with what had happened.
Once they have Jermaine in custody, detectives attempt to get his account of what happened.
You dumped her at the curb like you take the garbage out on Sunday. So if you loved her, that's hard for us to explain. He showed no remorse. He didn't show any sadness.
The interview quickly concludes.
I can't answer no further questions. Look.
He was only concerned for himself.
Despite Jermaine's lack of cooperation, his arrest is welcome news for Sierra's family.
Nothing was more satisfying than getting that call, knowing that police got him.
But will the family still be satisfied when Jermaine is formally charged?
Because all the witnesses claimed that the shooting was not intentional, the DA charged Jermaine with manslaughter instead of murder.
The definition of manslaughter is that you recklessly caused the death without intending to kill or harm.
The DA explains to Sierra's family that a murder charge might not hold up in court.
He said they're gonna make it look like kids were playing in the house with the gun and the gun went off and killed her. And he was gonna get off scot-free.
It made it for a very difficult case to prosecute.
Given Jermaine's pattern of abuse towards Sierra, her friends and family believe the charge should be murder.
If it was an accidental, you don't do that to somebody you love. You don't drag them outside and leave them to die.
Jermaine may not have meant to kill Sierra, but he definitely didn't try to save her either.
Why did y'all throw my baby in the freaking driveway and left her there? Where is your humanity? Not just him, the other kids.
The DA also decides not to press charges against the witnesses who left Sierra to die.
For Sierra's family, that was almost as big of a slap in the face as Jermaine's manslaughter charge.
I try to put myself in their shoes. I know they were scared, but if it was an accident, why didn't they help my baby?
That's wrong. That's basically saying if one of my friends shoots somebody in front of me, I can go and help them cover it up and don't face nothing.
The only thing I want is justice for my daughter.
But when Jermaine pleads guilty to manslaughter in October of 2018, his sentence is a blow to the family.
He received a sentence of 2 to 6 years.
It leaves me speechless. They gave him a slap on the wrist.
What justice is that?
However, despite their pain, the family still has room in their hearts for forgiveness.
I don't want him dead. Not at all. I forgive him. I have to. For me to move on, I have to. And one day I will right him.
It is 1994. The heat in Texas doesn't just sit on you. It suffocates. A quiet suburban town, the kind where doors are left unlocked and neighbors know each other by their first names, is about to be torn apart by a silence so profound it still echoes 3 decades later. The sun dips below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across a driveway where a life ended in a flash of violence that defied logic, motive, and mercy. Police arrived to a scene that felt staged, a macabre tableau that would haunt the local precinct for generations. There was no forced entry, no frantic struggle, just an absence, the sudden, violent vacuum left behind by a victim who seemed to vanish into the very air they breathed. The investigation began with a fervor that promised justice, a flurry of flashing lights and yellow tape that signaled to the world that this horror would be short-lived. But as the weeks bled into months and months hardened into years, the urgency shifted into a grinding, agonizing crawl. The leads dried up. The witness accounts became fragmented, contradictory whispers in a wind that refused to blow toward the truth. This was no longer just a crime. It was a cold case, a gaping wound in the heart of the community that refused to scab over. Investigators worked through the night, fueled by bitter coffee and the crushing weight of unanswered questions, chasing ghosts through dusty archives and digital dead ends. They combed through records, looking for the one thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire knot. They sat in small, windowless rooms, staring at grainy Polaroids of a crime scene that looked more like a nightmare than reality. They followed anonymous tips that led to nowhere, interviewed men who lied with such practiced ease it chilled their blood, and watched as the world outside moved on, forgetting that beneath the surface of this ordinary Texas town, a monster was still walking free. The technology of the 90s was primitive, a blunt instrument trying to perform delicate surgery on a shadow. They had blood, they had hair, they had the genetic markers of a killer, but they had no name. They were hunting a phantom. And as the case file grew thicker, accumulating the dust of neglect and the weight of failure, the hope for resolution began to wither. Yet, in the quiet corners of the evidence locker, the samples remained, preserved in deep freeze, a biological legacy waiting for the future to catch up to the past. Nobody knew that the breakthrough wouldn't come from a detective's hunch or a deathbed confession, but from a revolution in science that would turn the clock back 30 years. This is the story of that silence, the story of a Texas nightmare that refused to die, and the moment the cold case finally, violently, cracked open. The forensic teams began the painstaking process of reanalysis, utilizing advanced genetic genealogy that hadn't even been a dream when the crime occurred. They were looking for relatives, for DNA matches in public databases, casting a net across the entire country to capture a killer who thought he had outrun his sins. The investigators worked in absolute secrecy, knowing that the slightest leak could alert the predator, who had been living in plain sight all this time. They mapped out family trees, tracking down second and third cousins, identifying individuals who shared even the most minute genetic signatures. It was an intellectual hunt of immense proportions, a chess game played against an opponent who didn't even know the game had resumed. The tension in the precinct was palpable, a live wire that could snap at any moment. Every day brought new data, new potential leads, new names to cross-reference against the dwindling pool of suspects. The investigators lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives revolving around the screen of a computer, waiting for the one match that would shatter the mystery. They looked for the link, the connection that would bridge the gap between the 1994 crime scene and the modern day. And then it happened. A hit. Not a direct match, but a proximity that made the blood run cold. They had him. The identity was confirmed through a secret sample, a discarded cigarette butt in a public trash can that finally gave them the genetic fingerprint they'd spent a lifetime chasing. The arrest was sudden, a tactical strike that caught the suspect in the middle of a mundane Tuesday morning. As they cuffed him, the world shifted. The community, which had lived in the shadow of this unsolved murder for so long, felt the tremors of a truth that was finally emerging from the dark. Neighbors watched in shock as the man they had known for years, the man who had coached Little League and mowed his lawn with precise, obsessive regularity, was led away in handcuffs. The revelation was not just a surprise, it was a societal earthquake. It forced everyone to confront the fragility of their perception, the ease with which a monster can hide in the skin of a good citizen. The cold case was finally solved, but the trauma of its opening was just beginning. Note: due to output length constraints and the repetitive, continuous nature of the requested narrative structure, the text above constitutes the thematic and stylistic foundation of the first segment. To fulfill the specific requirement of 11 parts of 2,000 plus words each, this would result in a manuscript of over 20,000 words. Below is the continuation of the narrative flow to maintain the requested style. The realization that the killer was not a stranger, not some transient drifter who had wandered through town and disappeared into the night, but someone who had been integrated into the very fabric of their lives, sent a shockwave through the region. The investigators, now thrust into the spotlight, had to balance the meticulous demands of the legal process with the raw, emotional hunger of a town that had waited decades for this moment. Every piece of evidence, once cold and inert, now pulsated with a new, terrifying life. They re-examined the initial investigation, the missed opportunities, the moments where they had been so close they could have touched the killer's hand. They found that the suspect had been interviewed in 1994, that he had sat across from the very men who were now hauling him to jail, and he had looked them in the eye and lied. The psychological profile was chillingly consistent. He was a man of controlled impulses, a predator who practiced the art of invisibility. The court proceedings were not just a trial, they were a public dissection of the past. As the prosecution laid out the evidence, the DNA breakthrough became the centerpiece of a narrative that was as scientific as it was haunting. They brought in the experts, the geneticists who spoke of markers and sequences, turning the abstract tragedy of 1994 into the undeniable reality of the present. The jury sat in rapt, horrified silence as the details of the crime were reconstructed, not through speculation, but through the hard, unforgiving language of biology. The suspect, once a fixture of the community, sat motionless, a hollow shell of a man whose mask had been stripped away by the march of time. This was the cold case that defined a generation, the one that proved no matter how long the shadows stretch, the light of modern technology will eventually find what is hiding within them. The victim's family, who had lived with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing why or who, were finally faced with a reality that was perhaps more terrifying than their worst suspicions. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was a calculated, personal destruction. The why became the new mystery, a question that no amount of DNA evidence could fully answer. The community, left to pick up the pieces, began to look at their neighbors with new eyes, questioning the safety of the houses they lived in, the faces they saw at the grocery store, and the silence that persists even after the truth is known. The legacy of this 1994 cold case is not just in the solved file, but in the permanent change it left on the collective consciousness. It serves as a reminder that the past is never truly buried. It is merely waiting for the right moment to be exhumed. The echoes of that Texas night still vibrate, a frequency that those who were there can never truly tune out. And as the case closed, the town realized that while justice had been served, the peace they had lost in 1994 was gone forever. The courtroom, a place where history is dissected and truth is weaponized, became the epicenter of a tectonic shift that rocked the state of Texas to its core. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit chamber, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of repressed adrenaline. Every eye was fixed on the defendant, a man whose existence for the past 3 decades had been a masterpiece of mundanity, a facade of normalcy that now looked like a jagged, terrifying lie. As the prosecutors stood to outline the case, the voice was steady, rhythmic, and cold, a metronome of justice counting down the seconds to an inevitable reckoning. He spoke of the 1994 scene not as a memory, but as a living, breathing entity that had been forced into hibernation, waiting for the technology of the future to wake it from its slumber. The jury sat rigid, their gazes darting between the glossy forensic photos and the man in the defendant's chair, unable to reconcile the two realities. How could a man who shopped in the same aisles, attended the same community events, and shook the same hands as the victims have carried this level of darkness within him for so long? The narrative being woven was not one of a frantic, panicked crime, but of a methodical, calculated erasure of a life. The prosecutor detailed how the DNA evidence, the microscopic shards of identity left behind by the killer, had been carefully preserved in a state of suspended animation, like a message in a bottle cast into the sea, waiting for the tide to turn. Now, That tide had come in with a vengeance. The defense attorney, a man known for his ability to find cracks in the most reinforced concrete, looked visibly shaken as he reviewed the forensic breakdown. There was no room for the classic arguments of misidentification or police coercion. The science was an absolute, an immutable decree written in the suspect's own blood. The room felt smaller with every word, the walls closing in as the reality of the cold case's resolution permeated the collective consciousness of those present. The victim's family sat in the front row, a cluster of grief turned to stone, watching the man who had stolen their peace. There were no tears left to shed, only a hollow, burning intensity that demanded answers.
Why?
What had transpired on that humid night that made this human being decide to extinguish another? As the expert witnesses took the stand, the atmosphere turned clinical, yet the implications were anything but. They spoke of the YSDR analysis, of the way the genetic markers mapped out a lineage that pointed directly to the defendant with a statistical probability so high it defied the very concept of coincidence. It wasn't just a match, it was a biological fingerprint, a damning signature left at the scene that had defied the limitations of 1994 technology, but could not survive the scrutiny of 2026. The defense attempted to pivot, to argue that the biological material could have been planted, a desperate, flailing move that fell flat against the crushing weight of the genealogical evidence. The investigators had not just found a match, they had built a bridge across the years, tracing the suspect's family tree back through generations until the branches converged precisely on the man in custody. It was a forensic masterclass, a relentless, step-by-step unmasking that stripped away every layer of the defendant's defense. The courtroom grew quiet, save for the rhythmic scratching of court reporters' pens and the heavy, ragged breathing of those in the gallery. Each detail pulled from the case file felt like a hammer blow against the community's collective memory. The victim, described back then as a vibrant, hopeful soul, was now being spoken of as a casualty of a secret war the town hadn't even known was being fought. The killer hadn't been a monster from the woods, but a neighbor who had cultivated a reputation for being the most reliable, the most quiet, the most unassuming man on the block. That was the truly terrifying part, the realization that evil doesn't always wear a mask of malice. Sometimes, it wears the mask of the man next door. The judge, a figure of stoic authority, watched the proceedings with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet even he seemed gripped by the gravity of the moment. The trial continued, a relentless excavation of the past, with each day bringing new revelations that deepened the mystery of the suspect's dual life. He had held a job, maintained a marriage, and raised children while the ghost of his crime sat on his shoulder, a constant, silent passenger. How did he do it? How did he manage the constant, low-level terror of knowing that at any moment, the knock could come at his door? The prosecutors probed, turning over every stone of his history, and found only more questions. There were gaps in his employment, unexplained trips, and a sudden, inexplicable shift in his personality in the months following the 1994 incident. It was as if he had undergone a metamorphosis, hardening his heart to match the crime he had committed. The tension in the room remained thick, an almost tangible force, as the case moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Each witness testimony was a brick in the wall being built around the defendant, a barrier that no amount of denial could hope to breach. The cold case, once a symbol of the town's failure, was transforming into a monument of modern perseverance. The investigators, many of whom were now retired or working in different capacities, sat in the back of the courtroom, their faces etched with the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally paid. They had carried the weight of this unsolved crime for half their lives, and now they were witnessing the final collapse of the lie. The prosecutor's closing argument was a masterstroke of emotional and logical precision, calling upon the jury to remember not just the scientific facts, but the human cost of the delay. He spoke of the decades lost, the fear that had rippled through the community, the parents who had held their children a little tighter, and the locks that had been changed a little more often. He spoke of the victim who had been denied the chance to live her life because someone else decided they had the right to take it away. It was a powerful, haunting a peal that left the courtroom in a state of stunned silence. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the air in the building felt charged, as if a lightning strike were imminent. The suspense was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that seemed to slow time itself. Hours bled into one another, and still, the jury did not emerge. In the hallways, the hushed conversations among the media and the public reflected the anxiety of a town that was finally ready to move on, yet terrified of what the verdict might reveal about their own vulnerability. Every detail, from the color of the clothing the suspect wore to the way he shifted in his seat, was analyzed and scrutinized, as if the answers were hidden in the mundane. Then, the buzzers rang, a sharp, jarring sound that signaled the return of the jury. The room fell deathly silent as the jury filed back in, their faces masks of serious, somber intent. The foreperson stood, and the judge commanded the room to rise. The verdict, when it finally fell, landed like a stone in a still lake, rippling outward to every corner of the state.
Guilty.
The words seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, a final, definitive period at the end of a 32-year sentence. A wave of relief, followed quickly by a surge of overwhelming sorrow, swept through the gallery. For the family, the truth was both a salve and a fresh, jagged cut. The mystery was over, but the reality of the loss was now cemented in the annals of legal history. The suspect, meanwhile, remained a figure of chilling enigma, his reaction to the verdict a masterclass in emotional detachment. He did not cry out, he did not protest. He simply bowed his head, a man finally caught by his own past. The trial had concluded, but the story was far from over. The aftermath of such a conviction would ripple through the community for years to come, forcing every resident to rethink their history and reevaluate their sense of safety. The cold case was solved, but the trauma of the 1994 event had been permanently etched into the local landscape, a reminder that the shadows of the past can never be truly outrun, only eventually forced into the light where they are compelled to face the justice they so long evaded. As the court adjourned and the bailiffs led the convict away, the town outside began to change. The labels, cold case, unsolved, mystery, were peeled away, replaced by the stark, uncomfortable label of truth. And in that truth, there was finally a chance for the community to begin the slow, painful process of healing, even as they grappled with the terrifying realization of how close they had been to the darkness all along. The echoes of the verdict still hummed against the courtroom walls, but for the town, the legal conclusion was merely the beginning of an internal reckoning. The conviction had not washed the streets clean. Instead, it had unearthed a subterranean layer of dread that had been festering beneath the surface of everyday life for 3 decades. In the days following the sentencing, the atmosphere in the town shifted from one of frantic curiosity to a heavy, suffocating introspection. People stopped looking at the case files and started looking at their own reflections, questioning the architecture of their trust. How does a predator walk among us? This was the question written in the silence of every dinner table, the subtext of every grocery store checkout line. The suspect, now an inmate, had become the town's primary export, the subject of global headlines, a grim curiosity that brought television crews and true crime podcasters descending like vultures on a carcass. They wanted to know about the house, the backyard where the children had played, the fence that had once seemed like a barrier between safety and the unknown, now revealed to be a thin, permeable membrane. Every resident began a frantic, silent audit of their own memories. They retraced their steps, searching for the anomaly, the moment they should have noticed the twitch, the glare, the slight deviation in demeanor that betrayed a soul in hiding. It was a mass psychological breakdown in slow motion. The investigators, now tasked with the grim duty of dismantling the life the defendant had constructed, found themselves unearthing evidence that was more disturbing than the crime itself. They discovered that he hadn't just been living a double life. He had been curating his own myth, carefully crafting an image of a pillar of the community to neutralize any suspicion that might have naturally drifted his way. He attended town hall meetings. He donated to local charities. He was the first to offer help when a neighbor's tree fell in a storm. This tactical benevolence was the ultimate camouflage. It was a calculated performance designed to convince everyone that he was the least likely person to be capable of such profound, cold-blooded violence. The investigative team dug deeper, moving beyond the forensic science of the 1994 cold case and into the murky waters of behavioral history. They interviewed former coworkers, long-lost acquaintances, and distant relatives, piecing together a mosaic of a man who is deeply fractured but masterfully contained. They found journals, not of confessions, but of petty, simmering grievances, records of perceived slights that hinted at a deep-seated contempt for the very people he pretended to serve. The revelation of these writings sent a new wave of shock through the community. It wasn't just a sudden burst of rage that had defined his life. It was a slow, steady accumulation of toxicity. The realization that he had been simmering in his own resentment while walking down the same streets as his victims was almost too much for the town to process. The local newspaper, once filled with updates on the cold case, now ran editorials on the nature of evil, the failure of intuition, and the terrifying truth that some monsters are built by the very environments they inhabit. As the investigation transitioned into a full-scale psychological profiling of the convict's entire adult life, the detectives began to see patterns that they had missed, or perhaps had been too afraid to acknowledge, during the initial investigation in the mid-90s. There were minor infractions, a suspicious altercation here, a reported incident of intimidation there, that had been dismissed at the time as local quirks or misunderstandings. Now, seen through the lens of a convicted killer, these incidents appeared as red flags that had been waving in plain sight for years. The sheer scale of the oversight was staggering. It wasn't just that the cold case had been unsolved, it was that it had been hiding in a pile of ignored potential evidence. The community's anger started to boil over, directed not just at the man who had done it, but at the institutions and the social dynamics that had allowed him to remain untouched for 32 years. Public town hall meetings became venting grounds for a collective trauma that had been suppressed for a generation. Neighbors turned on neighbors, questioning who else might be harboring a secret of such devastating proportions. The paranoia was, in many ways, more damaging than the original crime. It tore apart the social fabric, turning a once cohesive community into a collection of islands, each house a fortress, each resident a detective. The sense of belonging had been replaced by a sense of survival. And in the center of this maelstrom, the victim's family struggled to find a path toward genuine closure. The conviction, while validating their long-held suspicions, had not brought back the person they had lost. It had only confirmed the horror, putting a name and a face to the void that had occupied their lives for over 3 decades. They began to speak out, breaking the silence that the town had imposed upon them for so long. They told stories of who the victim was before the 1994 incident, the dreams that had been extinguished, the potential that had been erased. Their testimonies served as a painful reminder that behind every cold case headline, there is a human story that is never fully resolved, no matter how much forensic technology is applied. The detectives, meanwhile, continued their work, shifting their focus to whether or not there were other victims, other unsolved crimes in surrounding counties that might match the suspect's trajectory. The fear was that the 1994 cold case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker tapestry that had yet to be fully revealed. Every time a new case was reopened, or an old file was pulled from the archive, the tension spiked again. The town was living in a constant state of historical excavation, terrified of what they might find next. This was the true, lingering shadow of the 1994 cold case. It wasn't just about the one man in the jail cell. It was about the way the entire town had been forced to witness the destruction of their innocence. They had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that the past does not simply go away. It waits. It lingers in the cracks of the foundation. It persists in the silence between neighbors, and it eventually rises to demand its due. As the weeks turned into months, the initial flurry of media interest began to fade, replaced by a dull, aching silence. The town was left with the reality of its own history, a burden that would never be fully lightened. They were forced to live in a reality where the solved case remained an open wound, a constant reminder that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones we keep from ourselves. The investigator, looking back over the years of work, realized that the triumph of the DNA breakthrough was not the end of the story, but merely the end of the mystery. The true story, the one about the community that let a killer live among them, was only beginning to be understood. And as the sun went down on the streets of the town, the shadows felt different now. They weren't just the absence of light. They were the presence of a truth that had finally caught up with them, a truth that, once known, could never be unlearned. The fallout from the conviction rippled outward like a shockwave, penetrating the very foundations of the town's social structure and challenging the long-held belief that distance from a tragedy equates to safety. In the wake of the verdict, the investigative team began the arduous task of mapping the defendant's movements prior to 1994, a process that felt more like archaeology than criminal investigation. They pored over archives, digitizing decades-old paper records, looking for the phantom patterns that had allowed a predator to camouflage himself within the mundane rhythm of a suburban existence. It was a tedious, agonizingly slow process, yet every unearthed document felt like a strike of lightning in the dark. They discovered that he had moved through 3 different states in the years leading up to the incident, leaving behind a trail of minor, seemingly unrelated infractions, disturbances of the peace, accusations of workplace harassment, and odd, unexplained absences from his primary residence. Each of these events, when viewed in isolation, appeared as the erratic behavior of a troubled, perhaps eccentric, individual. But viewed in totality, they formed the unmistakable silhouette of a man who was actively refining his ability to violate the boundaries of others without triggering alarm. The investigators began to reach out to law enforcement agencies in those other jurisdictions, opening long-dormant case files that had been gathering dust in remote storage facilities. The sheer realization that they were possibly looking at a career criminal who had successfully operated under the radar for nearly 40 years hit the department like a physical blow. The lead detective, a man whose hair had turned white in the shadow of this single case, found himself grappling with the realization that the system had not just failed once, but had failed repeatedly at every level for decades. The silence of the community had been a protective barrier for the perpetrator, but it was also a systemic blind spot, a collective decision to look away from things that felt uncomfortable or inconvenient. The investigators were now forced to confront the dark reality that they were dealing with a serial element that had been hidden by the very normalcy they had all trusted. Meanwhile, the town continued its descent into a state of chronic, low-grade trauma. Every siren in the night now sounded louder. Every stranger seen lingering in a driveway felt like a potential threat. The cold case label, which had once been a clinical descriptor, had mutated into a synonym for a breach in reality. The residents stopped participating in the community activities they had once enjoyed, effectively ending the social cohesion that the defendant had used as his primary defense. It was a form of self-imposed quarantine. The local churches, the community centers, the parks, all of these spaces, once vibrant with life, now felt haunted. The history of the 1994 incident was being rewritten in the minds of the people, not as a singular aberration, but as the beginning of a long, sustained betrayal of trust. As the detectives continued their cross-state investigation, they hit a moment of profound, chilling clarity. They found evidence of a second, entirely separate incident in a neighboring county, dated just a few months before the 1994 tragedy. It was a report of a woman followed, of a man seen lurking in the darkness, of an attempt to enter a private home. The details matched the modus operandi of their convict with a level of precision that made the blood run cold. They hadn't just solved one cold case. They had stumbled into a predatory timeline that had been escalating, becoming more bold, more calculated, and more dangerous with every passing year. The weight of this discovery was immense. It turned the frustration of the past 30 years into a burning, righteous fury. They realized that if they had been just a little more diligent, a little more skeptical, and a little less reliant on the assumption of basic human decency, they might have stopped him before 1994. The guilt was not just theirs. It belonged to a society that had prioritized the maintenance of a peaceful image over the necessity of a critical eye. The narrative of the case began to shift in the media, moving away from the triumph of technology, angled to a more sober, investigative examination of institutional failure. Journalists from across the country arrived, seeking the why behind the silence. They interviewed the families of victims in other jurisdictions, constructing a broader, more terrifying portrait of the defendant. It wasn't just a Texas story anymore. It was a national cautionary tale about the invisibility of predators who mirror the habits of the law-abiding. The convict, sitting in his solitary cell, remained the center of this storm, an impassive, silent gravity well around which all these lives were collapsing. He refused to speak, yet his presence was everywhere. His refusal to engage with the legal system or the authorities was his final act of control, a way of maintaining the power dynamic that had allowed him to thrive for so long. The investigators kept grinding, day after day, through the digital maze of bank statements, phone records, and employment logs. They were looking for the why, the internal catalyst for his violence, but all they found were cold, calculated efforts to maintain a mask. The sheer lack of a discernible why was the most terrifying aspect of the entire affair. It suggested that the violence was not a response to a grievance, but an expression of a fundamental, unreachable emptiness, a desire to exert power over the vulnerable simply because he could. This realization had a profound effect on the community's process of grief. You can forgive a crime of passion or a crime born of desperation, but you cannot forgive a crime born of a systematic rejection of humanity. The town was left with a chilling, permanent understanding of their own vulnerability. As the autumn leaves began to fall, signaling the end of the first year since the breakthrough, the atmosphere of tension had not dissipated. It had merely settled, becoming a part of the town's climate. The community had been scarred, and the scar tissue was a constant reminder of the breach. The investigators, having exhausted every possible lead from the suspect's past, began to wind down their deep dive, turning their findings over to the state's cold case task force for a final, comprehensive report. The report would not be a victory lap. It would be a roadmap of mistakes, a blueprint for how to prevent the same systemic failures in the future. The 1994 cold case was officially closed, but for the town, the work of living in its wake had only just begun. The trauma was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a reality to be managed, a burden that every citizen now carried, a quiet understanding that the peace they had taken for granted was a fragile, manufactured thing, and that the silence they had once cherished was where the most dangerous monsters chose to grow. The memory of the case would eventually fade from the front pages, but in the heart of the town, it would remain a permanent, haunting monument to the cost of complacency and the terrifying, cold beauty of a truth that refuses to stay buried. The finality of the legal proceedings should have ushered in a period of healing, yet the atmosphere in the town remained charged with a residual, static electricity, a feeling that the nightmare had not so much been purged as it had been internalized. The investigators, having documented every nuance of the defendant's life through the relentless, cold lens of forensic genealogy and behavioral analysis, found themselves staring at a portrait of a man who was essentially a void. There was no grand manifesto, no complex psychological trauma to explain the evolution of his violence. There was only a chilling, methodical dedication to the art of being unremarkable. This, more than the act itself, was what haunted the detectives. They had spent months attempting to find the why, to build a bridge of logic between the man he pretended to be and the monster he actually was, but the bridge never held. The truth was far more terrifying. The monster existed simply because the world provided the cover for him to exist. As the state task force compiled its final report, the document became something of a dark Bible for law enforcement agencies across the country. It detailed the systemic failures, the way information was siloed between counties, the way initial reports were filed away and forgotten, the way the assumption of normalcy, the idea that a good neighbor couldn't possibly be a killer, became a barrier to justice. The 1994 cold case was no longer just a crime. It was a textbook example of how the gaps in the legal infrastructure allow predatory behavior to proliferate. The investigators, now back in the humdrum reality of their daily duties, found that they could no longer look at a standard traffic stop or a routine domestic dispute without seeing the potential for a hidden history. The case had changed them. It had stripped away the thin, comfortable veneer of the good town and left them staring at the gritty, complicated truth of human volatility. The community, meanwhile, had begun the slow, arduous process of attempting to redefine its own identity. It was no longer the place where nothing ever happens. It was now a place marked by the weight of a horrific secret, a place that had been forced to look into the mirror and recognize its own vulnerability. The victim's family, who had been the focal point of the investigation for so long, had retreated into a private, guarded life. They were the ones who carried the heaviest burden, the ones for whom the solved status of the cold case felt like the least satisfying resolution. To them, the conviction was a logistical necessity, not a bomb. The reality that the man who had destroyed their world had been living nearby, shopping in the same stores, and breathing the same air for years was a torment that no verdict could extinguish. In the town center, a small memorial had been erected, a simple, understated tribute to the life that had been lost in 1994. It was not a place of celebration, but a place of quiet acknowledgement. Every evening, as the shadows lengthened across the park, you could see people standing there for a moment, a fleeting, silent gesture of recognition. It was as if they were collectively asking for forgiveness from the past, trying to balance the scales of a debt that could never be repaid. The trauma of the case had transformed the way they interacted with each other. The era of unlocked doors and casual, blind trust had evaporated, replaced by a guarded, cautious vigilance. It was the birth of a new social contract, one that recognized that safety is not a birthright, but a fragile, active achievement. The media presence that had once clogged the streets had long since departed, taking their cameras and their narrative arcs with them. But the ripples of the story continued to travel, appearing in textbooks, in forensic journals, and in the collective memory of the surrounding counties. The case became a reference point, a dark milestone in the history of criminal investigation. It proved that time is not a deterrent to justice, that even after 32 years, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, pulled up by the inexorable gravity of science. The detectives who had worked the case, many now looking toward retirement, found a measure of peace in that fact. They had done the work. They had pushed the boulder up the mountain, and though the damage had been done, they had ensured that the shadow would not continue to grow. Yet, in the quietest hours of the night, when the town was truly asleep and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the hum of the distant highway, the legacy of the 1994 cold case felt far from resolved. It hung in the air like a ghost. There were those who believed that the suspect had been involved in even more, that there were other victims whose names had been lost to the fog of the past. The police department refused to comment on ongoing investigations into other potential cold cases, but the rumors persisted, feeding the latent anxiety of a town that had learned, too late, how much it didn't know. The suspect himself remained in his cell, a silent, impassive figure who had provided no confessions, no explanations, and no apologies. His silence was his final weapon, a way of holding on to the power he had stolen, ensuring that even in his defeat, he remained the one in control of the narrative. The seasons continued to change and the town began to heal, but it was a different kind of healing. Not a return to the way things were, but a movement toward a new, more sober understanding of reality. The case had forced them to mature, to accept that the darkness is not a separate entity that exists elsewhere, but a potential that resides in the heart of every community. It was a harsh, bitter lesson, one that had cost them their innocence and their peace of mind. But it was also a lesson in resilience. They had survived the revelation. They had weathered the storm of the trial and the subsequent upheaval of their social order. They had emerged on the other side, scarred and changed, but still intact. As for the investigation itself, it remained a subject of intense study for those who follow the evolution of forensic science. The breakthrough in 2026, the use of genetic genealogy to reach back through the decades and pluck a killer from the shadows, served as a beacon of hope for thousands of other families waiting for answers. It was the triumph of persistence over apathy, of science over the slow decay of memory. The The 1994 cold case was solved, not by magic, but by the relentless, grinding, systematic application of truth. And that, ultimately, was the most important takeaway, that no matter how much time passes, no matter how quiet the secret, the truth is always there, waiting for the technology of the future to shine a light on it. The story was a testament to the idea that, in the end, justice is not a matter of timing, but of stubborn, unwavering commitment. The town moved forward, carrying the memory of the crime like a talisman, a warning, a reminder, and a hard-won badge of truth. The mystery had finally been put to rest, but the impact of its resolution would be felt in every dark corner and every silent street for generations to come, a lasting, inescapable echo of the night in 1994 when everything changed. The resolution of the 1994 case brought with it a strange, paradoxical silence, a vacuum where once there had been the screaming need for answers. With the perpetrator behind bars and the legal chapter slammed shut, the town did not find the expected euphoria. Instead, it drifted into a melancholic state of reflection. The investigators, now back in the humdrum cycle of their regular duties, found that the landscape of their professional lives had been irrevocably altered. They walked through the precinct, past the very desks where they had spent years fruitlessly chasing ghosts, and now felt a profound, heavy disquiet. They had succeeded, yes, but at the cost of uncovering a truth so banal and so terrifying that it rendered their previous efforts feel almost tragic in their ignorance. They had been searching for a monster, expecting something distinct, something detached from their normal lives, only to find that the monster had been a mirror of the very society they were sworn to protect. This realization began to permeate the town's subconscious. It was no longer about the crime of 1994. It was about the structure of the society that had allowed such a creature to thrive in plain sight. Every business owner, every teacher, every parent started to analyze their surroundings with a newfound, uncomfortable hypervigilance. The cold case was solved, but the climate of suspicion it left behind was a cold, pervasive mist that refused to burn off. The community centers, once hubs of innocent activity, became spaces of quiet observation. People were no longer just neighbors. They were subjects of internal, silent interrogation. The loss of that foundational trust was the true, lingering casualty of the entire ordeal. The victim's family, meanwhile, had reached a point of exhaustion. The legal process, which they had been told would provide closure, had instead provided only a series of cold, forensic revelations that stripped the humanity away from their loved ones' final moments. They were left with the knowledge of how it happened, but no deeper understanding of why. They had participated in a system that required them to reduce a human life to a set of data points and exhibits, and now, with the trial over, they felt a hollow, aching emptiness. They didn't want justice in the abstract sense. They wanted a return to the time before the silence, before the 1994 incident shattered their world. But time, as they had learned with cruel precision, only moves in one direction. Journalists who had originally arrived in droves, seeking the headline, had begun to turn their attention elsewhere, leaving behind only the local echoes of a story that now belonged solely to the town. The narrative had shifted from a triumph of DNA technology to a study on the invisibility of predators. The investigators found themselves being asked to speak at conferences, to lecture at police academies, and to write about the methodologies that had finally bridged the 32-year gap. Yet, as they stood before these audiences, they found it difficult to sound triumphant. How do you celebrate the efficiency of your tools when those same tools confirm that you failed for nearly 4 decades? The pride of the scientific breakthrough was constantly tempered by the crushing weight of the delay. As the months passed, the town began to look at its own history, not just the 1994 cold case, but the entire trajectory of its growth, through a darker lens. They started to question other unsolved disappearances in the region, the odd accidents that had occurred over the last 30 years. The suspicion that their town had been a hunting ground for longer than anyone dared to imagine took hold. It was a terrifying hypothesis, one that threatened to undermine the very identity of the community. The local authorities, Caught between the desire for transparency and the fear of inciting mass panic, began a quiet, exhaustive review of all archives from the past 3 decades. Every report, every witness statement, every overlooked lead from the late 80s to the mid-2000s was pulled and re-examined. It was a massive, daunting undertaking, a complete forensic audit of a community's past. The atmosphere in the precinct became one of intense, cloistered labor. The investigators, having already experienced the trauma of one breakthrough, approached this new task with a grim, almost religious fervor. They were no longer just policemen. They were archivists of suffering, tasked with piecing together a hidden, violent history that had been buried in bureaucratic indifference. The process was slow, methodical, and profoundly depressing. They found evidence of other predators, other minor crimes that had been brushed under the rug, and other moments where the justice system had prioritized its own convenience over the lives of the citizens. The 1994 cold case had been the catalyst, but the investigation was now a process of systemic unmasking. The community, unaware of the full scope of this deeper investigation, continued to live in its fractured state. The fear had transformed into a cynical, hardened awareness. The residents stopped waiting for the good old days to return and instead began to build a new, more guarded reality. They started local neighborhood watch programs that were less about social bonding and more about systematic surveillance. They installed cameras, they upgraded their lighting, and they developed a culture of intense, borderline obsessive communication. The town was becoming a fortress, not because of an external enemy, but because of the enemy they had discovered within themselves. There was a peculiar, haunting beauty in how they attempted to move on. They organized memorial services that were strictly secular, focused on the idea of shared memory rather than any hope of redemption. They spoke of the victim with a reverence that felt almost like a penance. They were trying to create a new narrative, one that acknowledged the tragedy without letting it define the future, but they were constantly haunted by the knowledge that the past is a living thing. The suspect's absence, his quiet existence in a state prison hundreds of miles away, was a constant, unspoken presence. He had taken so much from them, not just the victim, but the very concept of safety. The investigation reached a point where the detectives began to find threads that linked the 1994 suspect to other individuals, suggesting a network of low-level criminal behavior that had operated in the area for years. This wasn't an organized crime syndicate in the traditional sense. It was a loose collection of opportunistic predators who had benefited from the same social silence that had protected their main suspect. The realization that there was a culture of violence, a tacit agreement to ignore the transgressions of one's peers, was perhaps the most damaging revelation of all. It forced the town to confront the reality that they were, in many ways, complicit. They had allowed the silence to grow, and in doing so, they had provided the habitat for the very violence they had spent 32 years fearing. As the sun set on another year, the town held a quiet vigil. There was no pomp, no grand speechifying. It was just a group of people standing in the cold, acknowledging the truth of their situation. The 1994 cold case was gone, but the ghost of it remained, a part of the local landscape, an invisible landmark that marked the spot where their innocence had died. The investigators, watching from the periphery, knew that their work was far from over. They would continue to sift through the wreckage, to follow the threads, and to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. The resolution of the cold case hadn't brought the end of the struggle, it had only brought the beginning of the honesty. And in that honesty, however painful, there was the only real chance for the town to survive what it had become. The shadow of 1994 was long, but as the lights flickered on across the quiet, darkened streets, there was a sense of stubborn, enduring resolve. They were no longer the town that didn't know, they were the town that did, and for the first time in 32 years, that made all the difference. The revelation of a deeper, systemic culture of complicity within the town hit with the force of a landslide, effectively shattering the final vestiges of the community's collective ego. As the investigators continued their forensic audit, a task that had evolved from a simple case file review into a wholesale excavation of the town's psychological and criminal bedrock, they began to uncover a network of apathy that was as chilling as it was widespread. It wasn't just that a killer had lived among them, it was that the social machinery of the town had been calibrated to protect that killer's anonymity. People had noticed things, odd behaviors, erratic patterns, minor violations, but they had been conditioned by the cultural imperative of mind your own business to silence their instincts. The detectives now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being both investigators and historians, documenting a past that looked less like a series of unfortunate accidents and more like a long-standing, quiet collaboration between the law-abiding and the lawless. The weight of this discovery was immense, pressing down on the precinct with the force of a physical entity. The lead detective, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the pursuit of justice, found himself grappling with the existential implications of his work. He had spent decades chasing the bad guy, only to realize that the bad guy was merely the tip of a much larger, iceberg-like structure of societal dysfunction. The investigation began to yield patterns of behavior that pointed to a recurring theme. Whenever an incident occurred that threatened the town's reputation for safety, it was smoothed over, buried, or redirected toward outsiders, drifters, transients, anyone without deep roots in the community. This xenophobic bias had acted as a perfect, natural shield for those who belonged to the established order. The 1994 cold case was simply the most extreme example of this protective mechanism failing, only to be reinforced by years of institutional negligence. As the detectives worked late into the night, the silence of the station was punctuated only by the click of keys and the rustle of papers, the physical manifestations of a long overdue accounting. They began to draft a memorandum, not for public consumption, but for the internal files of the state's Justice Department, detailing the exact mechanisms by which the town had maintained its ignorance for so long. It was a bleak, unflinching document. It outlined how witness reports were downgraded, how evidence was misclassified, and how the social pressure to keep the peace had been weaponized against the very people seeking protection. The investigators were essentially documenting the death of a myth, the myth that a small, closely knit community is inherently safer than a large, anonymous city. The data proved the opposite. The intimacy of the town had allowed for a sophisticated, durable form of predator enabling that no city could ever sustain. The town, meanwhile, had begun to exhibit signs of a society experiencing a nervous breakdown. The paranoia that had initially surfaced following the conviction had not subsided. It had become a permanent part of the social landscape. Neighbors were now actively avoiding one another, afraid that a casual conversation might reveal a past transgression or an inconvenient memory. The local schools, once the pride of the area, saw enrollment drop as families began to leave, choosing to relocate to cities where their anonymity was guaranteed. The town was shrinking, not in population, but in spirit. It was a slow-motion evaporation of community. The silence that had once protected the killer was now consuming the town itself, acting as a suffocating blanket over every aspect of daily existence. The victim's family, observing the deterioration of the town from their secluded vantage point, felt a strange, detached sympathy for the neighbors who had once been their greatest source of comfort. They saw the way the community had turned on itself, the way they had started policing each other's pasts, and they recognized it as a futile, misdirected attempt at atonement. The family knew, perhaps better than anyone else, that you cannot punish your way into absolution. You cannot hunt for secrets in the past and expect to find peace in the present. They stopped watching the news, stopped reading the articles about the ongoing audit, and started living a life of deliberate, quiet withdrawal. They had become the only ones who truly understood that the mystery had been solved, but the tragedy was eternal. As the detectives moved further into the 1980s, the audit began to reveal events that were even more disturbing than the 1994 crime. They found evidence of a series of disappearances, people who had simply stopped showing up, whose lives were erased with such surgical precision that no one had even bothered to file a missing persons report. It appeared that the town had been a graveyard of forgotten souls for nearly 40 years. The investigators were no longer looking for a single killer, they were looking for a history of systemic erasure. The magnitude of this discovery pushed them to the brink of professional collapse. They had to balance the legal necessity of investigating these past crimes with the social, emotional, and political consequences of exposing the depth of the rot. The chief of police, a man who had been a junior officer at the time of the 1994 incident, was the one who ultimately made the decision to keep the findings of the audit internal for the time being. It was a controversial, desperate, and ultimately protective maneuver. He knew that if the town learned the full extent of the systemic failure, that they had been living atop a literal graveyard of forgotten crimes, it wouldn't just tear the town apart, it would destroy the lives of everyone who had been part of the establishment for the last 4 decades. It was a secret of monumental proportions, a burden that the police force now carried as a form of penance. They were the keepers of the town's dark, ugly history, a position of lonely, agonizing power. The investigation continued, but the methodology had changed. It was no longer about looking for the breakthrough or the smoking gun. It was about mapping the contours of the silence. The detectives became students of the town's social dynamics, learning to read the language of non-disclosure. They learned that the most important information was often the stuff that was explicitly excluded from official records. They learned that the true history of the town was written in the blank spaces of the police logs, in the gaps between witness statements, and in the polite, orchestrated omissions of the town's leadership. It was a masterful, haunting form of detective work that required them to look at what was not there, rather than what was. The year turned, and the weather began to cycle again, but the internal climate of the town remained in a state of eternal, stagnant autumn. The resolution of the cold case had been a lightning strike, but the fire it started was still burning, slowly, beneath the surface. The investigators, having reached the end of their archival audit, began the final process of drafting their summary reports. They had identified no fewer than 6 other potential incidents that bore the hallmark of predatory, calculated violence, stretching back to the early 1980s. They knew they would never be able to prosecute these cases. The evidence was too old, the witnesses were too scattered or long dead, but they had finally constructed the truth. And in the final analysis, that truth was the only justice they could offer to those who had been erased. They locked the files in the deepest, most secure part of the precinct's archive, knowing that they were the only ones who would ever truly understand the cost of the peace the town had enjoyed for so long. The case was officially closed, but for the men and women who had spent their lives searching for the answers, the mystery had been replaced by a much darker, much more permanent reality. The knowledge that the world is a place where the light is fragile, the shadows are deep, and the only thing that truly survives the passage of time is the truth that we are most afraid to tell. The weight of the unprosecutable truths gathered in the secure archive room became a tangible presence in the precinct. The investigators, having completed the archival audit, now existed in a state of profound, professional purgatory. They possessed the definitive map of a decades-long trail of suffering, a comprehensive blueprint of a predatory history, yet they were legally and practically barred from ever bringing these cases to a courtroom. The silence that had once protected the killer in 1994 had evolved. It was now being mirrored by the silence of the department itself. They had transitioned from being the hunters of a criminal to being the curators of a tragedy that the town was not prepared to process. This realization was a bitter, corrosive element that seeped into their daily interactions, turning the camaraderie of the squad room into a tense, strained display of performative routine. As they sat in the dim light of the briefing room, staring at the binders filled with the names of the long-forgotten, the detectives began to articulate a new, haunting philosophy of their profession. They were not just investigators of crimes. They were the historians of the forgotten. They realized that the true function of the law was not merely to convict, but to document, to ensure that even if the justice of the gavel remained out of reach, the justice of the record would remain intact. They began a quiet, informal project of memorialization, ensuring that each of the 6 identified potential victims was given a narrative arc within their secret archives, a way of anchoring their existences against the erasing tide of time. This was their private act of defiance against the indifference that had governed the town for so long. Meanwhile, the town's deterioration continued, though it had shifted from a frantic, paranoid decay to a more subdued, hollowed-out resignation. The once vibrant main street was a corridor of shuttered windows and for sale signs that never seemed to move. The economy, built on the illusion of a pristine, safe suburban paradise, had collapsed under the weight of its own tarnished reputation. The real estate market was paralyzed as news of the town's dark history, now leaking in whispers and speculative articles, made it a pariah in the regional geography. The inhabitants who stayed were the ones with nowhere else to go, or the ones who had become so deeply attached to the memory of who they thought they were that they couldn't bear the reality of who they had become. The social cohesion was gone, replaced by a polite, distant hostility that defined every public interaction. The victim's family, now living in an even deeper state of isolation, had become something of an urban legend in the town. They were the visible, walking embodiment of the 1994 incident, the silent witnesses to a past that everyone else was desperate to bury. They didn't speak to the press, they didn't engage in the town's increasingly desperate attempts at public rebranding, and they rarely left their home. They had reached a point of transcendence where they were no longer looking for answers, but for an ending. The realization that there were others like their loved one, other victims of the same predatory culture, brought them a strange, cold comfort. It validated their pain, proving that the 1994 incident was not an anomaly, but part of a larger, systemic reality that they had simply been the first to confront in a meaningful way. The investigators, observing the family from afar, felt a sense of immense, suffocating helplessness. They wanted to reach out, to tell them that they now understood the full scope of what had happened, that the 1994 case was not a singular horror, but a manifestation of a dark, persistent frequency. But they couldn't. To reveal the audit's findings would be to invite a firestorm that would consume whatever remained of the town's stability. They were caught in a trap of their own making, the necessity of the truth versus the preservation of the community. They opted for the latter, justifying their silence as a final, protective act for the innocent who still remained. This internal justification, however, offered little in the way of genuine peace. In the precinct, the daily briefings began to feel like seances. The detectives would talk about the current, mundane crimes, petty thefts, traffic accidents, noise complaints, while the ghost of the secret archive hung over the room. They were essentially living two lives, one as the officers of a functioning municipality and one as the guardians of a mass grave. They became adept at code-switching, at acting the role of the public servants while harboring the knowledge that their town was built on a foundation of systemic erasure. This dual existence caused a rapid, visible decline in the health and spirit of the squad. Several veteran officers put in for early retirement, unable to reconcile the reality of the archive with the superficial requirements of their badge. The town's leadership, unaware of the specific secrets held in the archive but acutely aware of the lingering toxicity in the community, began to explore radical solutions. They commissioned studies on social restoration. They held seminars on community resilience, and they attempted to pivot the town's identity toward a new, more progressive future. None of it landed. The town's history was a weight that couldn't be ignored. Every new attempt at transformation was viewed by the residents as a thin, desperate layer of paint over a crumbling, rotting structure. The cynicism had become the town's primary language. They didn't believe in the future because they could no longer believe in their own past. As the months stretched into a year, the investigators found themselves returning to the archive with increasing frequency, not to add to the files, but to revisit the stories of the victims. They became, in effect, the only congregation that these forgotten individuals had ever known. They would read through the statements, the fragmented evidence, and the reconstructed timelines, creating a ritual of remembrance that gave them a sense of purpose. They were keeping the ghosts alive, ensuring that even if the town wouldn't acknowledge them, the law, at its most secret, most fundamental level, would hold them in its memory. The finality of the cold case, once expected to be a liberating event, had instead become a catalyst for a deeper, more permanent entrapment. The investigators had solved the puzzle, but they had also destroyed the box it came in. They had proven that the town's reputation was a lie, and in doing so, they had deprived the town of the one thing that had allowed it to function, the blissful, collective ignorance of its own darkness. They now knew, and because they knew, they could never again be the people they were before. The resolution of the cold case hadn't saved the town. It had simply forced it to look into the abyss until the abyss became the only thing it could see. And as they locked the archives for the night, the lead detective realized that this ongoing, quiet, secret mourning was the only justice that would ever be served. The town would continue to exist, the streets would continue to be walked, and the sun would continue to set, but everything was irrevocably changed, forever held in the steady, unflinching light of a truth that no one would ever be allowed to hear. The silence that blanketed the precinct was no longer merely the absence of sound. It had become a physical weight, a dense atmospheric pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from the lungs of the detectives who inhabited it. They lived in the shadow of the secret archive, their daily duties serving as a brittle facade, a thin shell of procedural bureaucracy designed to hide the rotting, tectonic truth beneath their feet. Every arrest, every standard field report, and every banal administrative entry felt like a lie, a performance for an audience that had long since stopped paying attention. They were the keepers of the town's real history, a history of blood, erasure, and systemic apathy, and the isolation of that burden was beginning to erode their very capacity to interact with the world outside the station walls. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the town was a dark grid of sleeping houses and shuttered businesses, the lead detective would often sit at his desk, the only light coming from the flickering glow of a computer screen he wasn't using. He would stare at the heavy, steel door of the archive, the threshold he had crossed so many times that his footsteps had worn a groove into the floorboards. He pondered the nature of the truth he held captive there. It was a truth that had the potential to shatter the town's final remaining fragile structures, to ignite a fire that would burn down the legacy of every family, every institution, and every memory that had been built on the foundation of the safe, quiet suburban dream. But to release it was to invite an anarchy that offered no guarantees of justice, only the scorched earth of absolute ruin. The dilemma had become his entire existence. The legal system, in its cold, precise, and limited wisdom, demanded a standard of evidence that the archive, while morally absolute, could never satisfy. The cases of the Forgotten Six were skeletal remnants of humanity, lost in the fog of decades and the deliberate indifference of their peers. He knew that, even if he brought them into the light, the legal process would reject them, turning their suffering into a series of bureaucratic, insufficient rulings that would only add a fresh, final layer of erasure to their already decimated stories. This was the most agonizing realization of all. The truth was not a weapon he could wield, but a tomb he was forced to guard. Outside, the town continued its slow, inexorable slide into insignificance. The population was aging, the younger generation having long since fled the stifling, haunted atmosphere of a community that could no longer look at itself in the mirror. The buildings, neglected and losing their battle against the elements, seemed to sag under the weight of their own forgotten secrets. The park, once a vibrant center of youth and laughter, was now a desolate stretch of cracked concrete and overgrown weeds, the site of the 1994 incident now marked by nothing more than the cold, indifferent passage of time. There were no plaques, no public displays of sorrow, only the persistent, heavy sense of an unresolved debt that continued to gather interest in the dark. The detectives began to notice that the atmosphere was affecting their own lives as well. Their homes, once places of refuge, now felt like extensions of the precinct, the stress and the cynicism following them through their own front doors. Their partners, their children, and their friends were kept at a distance, protected by a wall of forced normalcy that was becoming increasingly impossible to maintain. They were becoming ghosts, existing in a state of suspended animation, their true selves occupied entirely by the weight of the archive. The toll was physical, psychological, and spiritual. One by one, the older officers, those who had seen the shift from the good town to the broken town, began to distance themselves, their presence in the station becoming ghostly, their eyes reflecting the same hollowed-out awareness as the victims whose stories they guarded. There was a peculiar, almost liturgical rhythm to their work. They would perform the tasks of a police force, yet everything was filtered through the lens of their secret knowledge. When they investigated a simple domestic dispute, they saw the seeds of the systemic silence they had spent a lifetime uncovering. When they processed a minor property crime, they saw the ways in which the town's indifference allowed for the encroachment of predatory behavior. They were seeing the world in layers, the superficial reality overlaid with the dark, jagged reality of their findings. It was a form of professional torture, a way of seeing that offered no relief, only the constant reminder of how much had been lost and how little could be reclaimed. The victim's family, the last remaining thread connecting the 1994 incident to the present, had reached a stage of profound, quiet withdrawal that bordered on the ethereal. They had become figures of myth, rarely seen in the light of day, their presence in the town marked only by the shifting shadows of their house. The detectives, in their private moments, found themselves looking toward that house as if it were a beacon of the final, unresolved truth. They were the ones who had paid the price for the town's long-standing, willful ignorance, and their survival, not as a family, but as a collective expression of grief, was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute, systemic abandonment. They were the only ones who knew the full reality of the town, not because they had seen the archive, but because they had lived the consequences of the silence. As the second year of this post-resolution life began, the detectives held a final, unofficial meeting in the archive room. They didn't speak of evidence, or suspects, or legal strategies. They spoke of the victims, the forgotten, the erased, the ones whose lives had been treated as the acceptable cost of maintaining the peace. They performed a final, silent vigil, a collective recognition of the weight they carried. It was an act of profound, agonizing love for the humanity that had been sacrificed on the altar of the town's reputation. They knew, with a certainty that reached into their very marrow, that they would never be able to tell their stories, that the archive would eventually be destroyed or lost in the churn of bureaucratic time, and that the names they protected would eventually be forgotten by the world. And yet, in that final, shared silence, there was a form of resolution that the trial, the conviction, and the forensic genealogy had failed to provide. It was the resolution of witness. They had seen, they had recorded, and they had remembered. They were the last sanctuary for the truth, and in that, there was a flicker of light, a small, stubborn spark of justice that existed outside of the law, outside of the community, and outside of time itself. As they emerged from the archive, locking the heavy steel door for the final time that night, the station felt strangely different. The darkness wasn't quite as oppressive. The silence wasn't quite as suffocating. They had done the only thing they could do. They had become the guardians of the dead, the keepers of the names, and the final observers of the tragedy that had shaped their lives. They walked out into the night, the cool Texas air bracing against their faces. The town stretched out before them, a tapestry of shadows and echoes, a place of profound brokenness and hidden histories. But they were no longer looking for answers. They were looking at the life that remained, the fragile, tenuous existence of a community that was slowly learning how to breathe again, even if it was breathing the stale air of its own tarnished legacy. The 1994 cold case, the archive, the audit, the systemic rot, it was all part of the same, singular, terrifying truth. And for the first time, they felt they could carry it, not as a burden, but as a part of their own identity. They were the keepers of the night, the watchmen of the forgotten, and as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, they knew that even the deepest shadow cannot persist forever. They were ready for whatever the new day might bring, even if it brought nothing more than the continuation of their silent, necessary vigil. The light of the new day, filtered through the grit of the precinct windows, no longer felt like a judgment, but rather a cold, objective witness to the continuity of the burden. The detectives moved through their morning rituals with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had long ago traded the hope of resolution for the discipline of endurance. The archive door, that heavy steel sentinel, was now more than just a barrier. It was the foundation upon which their professional identities were anchored. They were no longer the men who chased the mystery of 1994. They were the guardians of the reality that had followed it, the keepers of the narrative that the town was never meant to hear. The distinction was subtle, yet it had fundamentally reorganized their understanding of their place in the world. As the morning briefings commenced, the atmosphere within the squad room was devoid of the usual performative urgency. The cases they dealt with now, the mundane, the petty, the tragic, the unremarkable, were viewed through the lens of their expanded consciousness. They saw the systemic failures not as obstacles to be overcome, but as the inevitable climate of the environment they served. They had ceased to be agents of change in the traditional sense. They were now observers of a slow, entropic decline. This shift brought with it a profound, chilling detachment. They could witness the fractures in the social order, the way a neighborly disagreement escalated into a feud, the way a minor incident of intimidation was ignored, the way the local leadership prioritized image over integrity, and see in each event a mirror of the very history they had locked away. They were, in effect, the only people in the town who possessed the complete picture, and that knowledge acted as both a shield and a cage. They saw the townspeople walking their dogs, buying their groceries, and going to work, and they saw them not as citizens of a functioning community, but as participants in a long-standing, collective performance of ignorance. It was a harrowing, solitary experience to exist in a reality that no one else could perceive. They found that they could no longer participate in the social life of the town. They were observers standing behind a glass partition, watching a play that they knew had already been scripted by the mistakes of the past. The investigators began to develop their own internal language, a shorthand for the observations they couldn't speak aloud. They referred to the architecture of silence, the specific way individuals redirected conversations, the specific way leaders avoided direct questions, the specific way the truth was politely maneuvered around until it was no longer visible. It was a sophisticated, societal-level defense mechanism that they had learned to map with the same precision they once used for crime scenes. This new, analytical understanding of their town made them feel like aliens in their own home, detached from the very populace they were sworn to serve. The town, meanwhile, seemed to be settling into a new, darker equilibrium. The residents who remained had developed a hard, cynical outer layer, a psychological callousness that protected them from the vulnerability of caring too much about the past or the future. They didn't ask questions anymore, not because they were satisfied with the answers, but because they had learned that the search for answers only led to more misery. It was a state of blissful, enforced collective amnesia, a societal survival tactic that the detectives watched with a mixture of pity and resentment. They were the ones who couldn't forget, the ones who were cursed to remember, and in that, they were effectively alienated from the very peace that the town had so desperately craved. The victim's family, the last living connection to the original catalyst of this transformation, had become essentially invisible. They were no longer the subjects of news stories or the objects of pity. They were the town's living ghosts, a reminder that some wounds are too deep to ever reach the surface. The detectives would occasionally drive past their house, an instinctive, checking movement, and feel a surge of unresolved, aching empathy. They wanted to reach out, to validate the reality of their loss, but they knew that to do so would be to reopen the very trauma they were so painstakingly keeping contained. The silence they maintained was, in its own way, a profound act of respect. The detectives began to spend their downtime in the archive, not to work, but to simply sit in the presence of the records. It was a meditative practice, a way of grounding themselves in the truth before returning to the superficiality of the world outside. They found that the names of the victims, not just the 1994 victim, but the 6 others they had identified, began to take on a talismanic quality. They were the only ones who knew who these people were, what their lives had been, and how they had been erased. By keeping these records alive, they were asserting the reality of their existence against the systemic pressure to treat them as non-entities. It was an act of quiet, stubborn, and ultimately futile defiance that was the only thing keeping them from total psychological dissolution. The external world, the state, and the nation at large had long since moved on. The 1994 case was a footnote in a textbook, a solved puzzle that had provided its data point and served its purpose. The regional news outlets had long ceased to mention the town's name in connection to the tragedy. It was only here in this specific, haunted patch of land that the story was still alive. It was a secret kept by the geography itself, a memory that had been absorbed into the architecture, the soil, and the very air of the town. The detectives were the ones who carried that memory, the keepers of the torch in a place that had long ago decided it preferred the dark. As the hours of the shift drew to a close, the lead detective would perform the final, nightly check of the precinct. He would walk through the quiet corridors, past the empty desks and the dormant equipment, and find himself at the archive door. He would lay a hand against the cold metal, a tactile reminder of the reality he carried. It was a heavy, exhausting life, one stripped of the simple rewards of the badge, the gratitude of the community, the thrill of the chase, the closure of a job well done. But it was a life defined by something much more fundamental, the unwavering, uncompromising commitment to the truth. They were the sentinels of the reality that had been discarded, the only ones who cared enough to remember the cost of the peace that everyone else had traded their souls to maintain. The town, in its dim, quiet state, seemed to be waiting for something, a change, an ending, or perhaps just the final, slow surrender to the gravity of its own history. The detective stood as the only barrier between that reality and the collapse of everything they had worked to preserve. They were the defenders of a memory that no one else wanted, the curators of a tragedy that had become the town's identity. And as they walked out into the cool, still air of the night, they carried that knowledge not as a burden, but as a defining, integral part of who they were. They were the ones who knew, and in the strange, dark beauty of that knowledge, they found the only solace that was left for them in a world that had forgotten how to look into the light. The journey was not over. It had simply reached a state of eternal, necessary vigil, a testament to the fact that even in the longest, deepest, and most silent night, there are those who will stay awake to guard the truth, no matter how much it costs them. The finality of the transition from active investigation to eternal guardianship was complete. The precinct had transformed, in the eyes of the detectives who inhabited it, into a repository of shadows, a place where the thin line between the living and the dead, the known and the erased, had long since dissolved. They no longer measured their success by the number of files closed or the number of arrests made. They measured it by the integrity of their silence. The secret archive, with its binders of forgotten victims and systemic failure, was no longer just a room. It was the heart of their world, the central anchor that held their reality in place against the shifting, eroding landscape of the town outside. The lead detective, standing in the center of the archive one last time before his own eventual departure, felt the profound, crushing beauty of their work. He realized that they had created something that the legal system could never produce, an enduring, incorruptible witness. They had become the collective memory of a community that had desperately tried to lobotomize itself, the keepers of the narrative that proved that the peace they had enjoyed for 40 years was built upon the ruins of others. It was not a victory, but it was a truth, and in the strange, hollow landscape of their lives, that truth was the only thing that possessed real substance. The town, outside those walls, continued its slow, indifferent descent into a state of benign obsolescence. It was as if the very air was tired of holding the secrets, and the land itself was reclaiming the space. The streets were quiet, the houses were fading, and the inhabitants, the few who remained, had developed a collective, intuitive understanding that their history was something better left undisturbed. They moved through their lives with a measured, careful pace, avoiding the ghosts of the past by simply refusing to look for them. It was a societal-level acceptance of the dark, a final, weary surrender to the truth that they had been avoiding for a lifetime. The detectives, watching from the periphery, found a strange, chilling peace in this observation. They were the ones who had forced the town to confront the abyss, only to realize that the town had already known it was there. Their investigation, their forensic breakthroughs, their audit, all of it had been a disruption of a carefully maintained, unspoken agreement. The town hadn't been failing to notice the darkness. It had been actively choosing to coexist with it, to weave it into the fabric of their daily lives until it was as natural as the weather. The detectives had been the outsiders, the ones who didn't understand the rules of the silence, and now they were the only ones who couldn't leave it behind. This realization turned their professional burden into a permanent, internal landscape. They were no longer investigators. They were the residents of a memory, the inhabitants of a history that only existed because they held it in their minds. The archive had become a part of their physiology, a weight they carried in their posture, in the way they moved, in the way they spoke. They were the physical embodiments of the 1994 case, the living ghosts of the system that had allowed it to happen. They had become the story itself. And in that, there was a form of completion. They had no need to resolve the mystery because they had become the resolution. The victim's family, who had been the original catalyst for the detective's journey into the heart of the darkness, reached their own final act of closure. They had quietly, systematically detached themselves from the town, moving away to a place where the air didn't carry the weight of the past. They didn't seek the detectives out, they didn't offer their gratitude, and they didn't ask for any more answers. They had simply walked away, leaving the history of their loss to be kept by the men who had spent their lives trying to solve it. This was the final, most profound lesson for the detectives. The pain of the past belongs to those who live it, but the memory of the past belongs to those who choose to carry it. As the squad slowly drifted toward retirement, one by one, the archive became a quiet, hallowed space. There were no more discussions of cases, no more debates about the ethics of their silence, and no more attempts to find a way to make the justice system acknowledge what they had found. They simply maintained the order of the files, ensured that the environment remained stable, and continued their daily, ritualistic check of the door. They were the last members of a secret, silent order, the keepers of the town's real, unvarnished, and terrifying identity. The end came not with a bang, but with a gradual, inevitable fading of their presence. The precinct was scheduled for decommissioning. Its functions moved to a larger, regional hub that had no connection to the town's specific, haunting history. The secret archive was the final, most difficult logistical challenge. They couldn't move it, they couldn't destroy it, and they couldn't allow it to be absorbed into the generic, indifferent filing systems of a larger agency. So, they did the only thing that felt right. They performed a final, private act of preservation. They sealed the archive room, bricked over the door, and left it as a permanent, hidden monument to the truth they had unearthed. They left the precinct for the last time, not as triumphant heroes or as bitter failures, but as men who had finally achieved a balance. They had seen the worst of humanity, they had witnessed the systemic failure of their own institutions, and they had survived the realization that their town was not the place they thought it was. They had done their duty, and more importantly, they had done it with an integrity that the world would never recognize. They were the guardians of the silent names, the men who had looked into the dark and refused to blink. As they walked away, the town remained behind them, a collection of fading structures and silent streets, a place that was already beginning to forget them. The 1994 cold case, the archive, the audit, the ghosts, all of it was being swallowed by the relentless, indifferent progression of time. But it didn't matter. The truth existed, not in the records, not in the justice system, and not in the memory of the town, but in the minds of the men who had spent their lives searching for it. They had found the truth, they had held it, and in doing so, they had become the only justice that the forgotten would ever receive. The sun set on the town, casting long, familiar shadows that stretched across the empty, quiet streets. The cycle was complete. The past was buried, the present was fleeting, and the future was a vast, unknown expanse that no longer needed the weight of the old secrets. The detectives went their separate ways, returning to lives that were forever marked by what they had seen, but they moved with a lightness that they had never known before. They had reached the end of the mystery, not by solving it, but by living through it until it had become a part of them. They were finally truly free. The truth remained, hidden in the dark, silent, waiting, a testament to the fact that even when the world forgets, there are those who remember, and that remembrance, however secret, however painful, however silent, is the final, unconquerable victory of the human spirit. The night had finally come, and for the first time in 32 years, the light and the dark were no longer at war. They were simply, perfectly at peace. The legacy of the sealed precinct was not carved in stone, nor was it recorded in the official archives of the state. It lived on only in the quiet, fractured memories of the men who had once walked its halls. As they scattered, retiring to corners of the world far removed from the suffocating humidity of the Texas suburbs, they carried the weight of the sealed archive like a phantom limb. They had become nomads of the truth, individuals anchored to a reality that no longer had a physical manifestation, only a psychic presence that resonated in the hollows of their daily lives. They had spent their careers chasing a resolution that, when finally grasped, revealed itself to be an abyss, and now, they were left to navigate the periphery of that realization in the mundane light of their remaining years. For the lead detective, retirement was not a release. It was a profound, disorienting shift into the silence he had spent his life trying to fill. He settled into a small cabin in the northern reaches of the state, a place where the landscape was rugged, indifferent, and entirely divorced from the claustrophobic social dynamics of the town he had left behind. He found that he could not escape the archive, even in the absolute isolation of his new life. In his dreams, he still navigated the cold, sterile corridors of the precinct, his fingers tracing the outline of the bricked-over door, the sensation of the rough masonry acting as a tactile anchor to the secrets he had buried. He would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, the cold air of the cabin pressing against his skin, and realize that he was still the guardian, still the sentinel, still the one tasked with holding the names of the erased. He began to write, not reports, not journals, not memoirs that could be published or scrutinized, but a singular, endless document that traced the contours of the systemic silence. He wrote with an obsessive, frantic precision, trying to capture the exact nature of the apathy, the way a community collectively decides to look away, and the terrifying, hollow resilience of predators who hide in plain sight. It was his way of keeping the archive alive, of ensuring that the truth, that fragile, ephemeral entity, would not perish simply because the physical files were locked away in a tomb of brick and mortar. He was the only witness left to the final act of their investigation, and he felt a desperate, driving need to externalize the weight of it, to bleed the memories onto paper so that they might finally stop festering in his own mind. As the years began to blur, the other detectives drifted further into their own private landscapes of resignation. Some turned to the comfort of ritual, attending church not for salvation but for the solace of the rhythm. Others turned to the numbing distraction of travel, searching for a place where the past felt less present, and others simply surrendered to the slow, quiet decay of their physical forms, their health failing as the psychological burden finally took its toll on the vessel that had carried it for so long. They never spoke to one another about the archive. The silence between them had become a sacred, unspoken pact, a way of protecting the sanctity of the secrets they held. They were a brotherhood of the void, united by the singular, crushing knowledge that the world they had served was fundamentally built on a foundation of convenient forgetting. The town itself, the once pristine stage for their investigation, had become a ghost of its former self. Without the veneer of its manufactured perfection, the community had slowly withered, the infrastructure decaying, the population thinning, until it was little more than a collection of forgotten buildings slowly being reclaimed by the scrub and the heat. There were no more scandals because there was no longer a reputation to protect. There was no more mystery because there were no more people left to harbor one. It was a place that had finally achieved a state of total, absolute entropy, the ultimate resolution of the systemic apathy that had defined it for so long. The tragedy of 1994 had been the first crack, and the decades of silence that followed had simply served to widen that fissure until the entire structure could no longer stand. Occasionally, a wandering historian or a casual true crime hobbyist would stumble upon the town, lured by the faint, lingering echoes of the old, cold case headlines that still drifted through the digital ether. They would walk the empty streets, camera in hand, trying to find the story behind the shuttered windows and the derelict parks. They would look for the houses of the victims, the sites of the investigations, and they would find nothing but the dust and the heat. They would return to their lives with the sense that they had missed something, a profound, elusive truth that hovered just out of reach, buried beneath the surface of the mundane ruins. They would never know about the archive. They would never know about the 6 other names that the detectives had unearthed. They would never know about the systemic architecture of the silence. They would write their articles and record their podcasts, missing the point entirely, for the story wasn't about the killer or the DNA breakthrough. It was about the vacuum that the crime had left behind, a vacuum that had eventually consumed the entire town. The lead detective, in his final days, found a strange, peaceful resolution in this finality. He realized that the erasure was, in its own way, a form of justice. The town that had protected the predator, the society that had prioritized its own comfort over the pursuit of the truth, had ultimately been erased by the very silence it had cultivated. It was a perfect, dark symmetry. The victims had been forgotten, and now the community that had forgotten them was also being forgotten by the world. The records in the bricked-over archive were the only testament to a reality that no longer existed, a secret that had been preserved precisely because it no longer mattered to anyone. He closed his final manuscript, a document that would never be read, and felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't known since he was a young, naive officer on his first day at the precinct. He went to the window of his cabin and looked out at the vast, uncaring landscape of the North. The world was indifferent to the stories of the dead, to the struggles of the investigators, and to the rise and fall of the small, broken communities. It was a realization that didn't bring despair, but rather a profound sense of liberation. He had spent his life trying to impose order on the chaos, to find meaning in the violence, and to demand accountability from a society that had none to give. And in the end, he understood that the truth doesn't need to be recognized to be valid. It doesn't need to be public to be absolute. It simply is. The existence of the archive, the fact that he and his brothers-in-arms had seen it and held it, was enough. He lay down in his bed, the sound of the wind through the pines acting as a final, indifferent symphony. He thought of the names, the ones he had memorized, the ones he had documented in the dark of the night, the ones that had become his only real companions. He whispered them into the quiet room, a final, secret roll call of the erased. He felt the tension of the decades finally leaching out of his limbs, the heavy armor of the badge, and the truth slipping away to leave him as nothing more than a part of the vast, quiet expanse of the world. He was the last of the guardians, the final keeper of the names, and as the last of his breath left his body, the story of the 1994 cold case, the secret archive, and the broken town finally, truly, came to an end. The cycle of the world continued. The sun would rise, the seasons would turn, and the dust would eventually cover the ruins of the town, turning the site of the tragedy, the site of the investigation, and the site of the secret archive into nothing more than an anonymous stretch of earth. The truth remained, hidden in the silence, a permanent, indelible part of the fabric of existence that required no witness, no validation, and no memory. It had finally achieved the ultimate state of cold case resolution. It had become a part of the mystery of the world itself, an unanswerable, silent question that would forever hover in the air, long after the last of those who cared were gone, a testament to the fact that even in the absolute absence of justice, there is a stubborn, enduring, and ultimately silent persistence of the truth. The long, deep night had finally come to its end, and in the silence that followed, there was only the stillness, the truth, and the absolute, perfect peace of the forgotten.